All right, so we're diving into a story about Puerto Rico and its relationship with the mainland U.S.
Okay.
It starts with fire. New Year's Eve in Cabo Rojo.
Right.
There's this woman caught on camera with a gasoline can.
Mm.
And minutes later, a local restaurant and some of the neighboring businesses go up in flames.
Yeah.
The financial blow to that family was just huge, but it was the symbolism that really got to people.
Right.
It ignited something much bigger.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It wasn't just about the property damage. For a lot of Puerto Ricans, this tapped into a well of frustration about mainlanders. This feeling of disrespect, almost like a sense of entitlement. And all the sources you've shared for this deep dive, the article from the New Yorker and the academic lectures, even those blog posts all point to this growing tension.
So we've got this arson as a starting point, but to really understand it, we need to zoom out.
Yeah.
Look at the bigger picture. Let's unpack Puerto Rico's history as a colony.
Right.
How that's morphed into what some people are calling neocolonialism, and how all of this is playing out in people's everyday lives.
It's essential to start with the history. Centuries under Spanish rule, and then 1898 comes around, the U.S. takes over. But it's not a clear-cut situation. Puerto Rico becomes this unincorporated territory.
And that's where things get complicated.
Yeah.
They're U.S. citizens, but there's this asterisk.
Right.
The sources emphasize how they can't vote for president from the island, and Congress has this enormous power over them, even though there's no direct representation. It's like taxation without full representation, a throwback to those revolutionary times.
That's a really striking comparison.
On an island paradise.
And it feeds into this concept of neocolonialism. It's a much more subtle form of control. Think less about military occupation and more about economics and even culture. Those are some of the levers that the dominant power uses.
So let's apply that to the arson. The New Yorker goes into a lot of detail about what led up to it.
Okay.
So you have this tourist, apparently drunk, causing a scene. Staff refusing to serve her more alcohol. The police are called, not once, but twice.
And what's really interesting is how those details were perceived. The restaurant owner wanted her detained, but their officer, well, he was later suspended pending investigation.
And it wasn't even really the fire itself that fueled the outrage. It was this sense of different treatment.
Yeah.
This perceived double standards.
Exactly.
It was like pouring gasoline on an already simmering resentment. And then, just days later, you have another tourist that assaults a waitress in a different town.
Yeah.
And both of these incidents were caught on video.
Right.
And boom, it goes viral, and there's this huge outrage.
Yeah, those videos became these symbols not just of individual bad behavior, but of a larger imbalance. Suddenly everybody was talking about neocolonialism, not just academics.
Okay, so we've got this backdrop of unequal power dynamics.
Yeah.
And then these flashpoint events like the arson.
Yeah.
Let's dig into how neocolonialism manifests in everyday life in Puerto Rico.
Right.
The sources highlight the economy as a major battleground.
Absolutely. You have to talk about the Jones Act and cabotage laws. On the surface, it's all about shipping. All goods that travel between U.S. ports, including Puerto Rico, have to be on U.S. ships.
Sounds simple enough, but the sources argue it's anything but.
Exactly. These U.S. ships are much more expensive to operate, and those costs get passed on to consumers in Puerto Rico.
Right.
It makes the cost of living artificially high, almost like a stealth tax that benefits U.S. companies while hurting the island.
And that economic control limits Puerto Rico's autonomy.
Right.
It's not even just about high prices. It's about who's really calling the shots.
Precisely. And then we add another layer, Act 60. Originally Acts 20 and 22, this was intended to solve the economic woes by attracting mainland investment through these massive tax breaks.
Okay, so no federal capital gains tax.
Right.
A tiny 4% corporate rate.
Yeah.
It's basically a haven for the wealthy.
Yeah.
And of course, that brought a wave of mainlanders moving in, especially during the pandemic when remote work took off.
And that's where the changing attitudes towards foreigners become really apparent. Yeah. I mean, the intention was good. Stimulate investment, create jobs. But the reality, well, the New Yorker piece highlights how this influx drove up real estate prices like crazy.
Yeah.
We're talking a 63% increase in average home prices between 2012 and 2021.
Wow. That's huge. But I'm guessing it wasn't good for everyone.
Right. It's one thing to attract investment. It's another when locals are priced out of their own communities.
Exactly.
And the data backs that up. There was a 740% jump in all cash home purchases.
Oh, wow.
Nearly 25% of new buyers have non-Hispanic last names. It paints a picture of who benefits the most from this boom.
And it's not necessarily the people who already live there.
Exactly.
So rising costs, a sense of being displaced, It's easy to see how that resentment could grow, especially when you tie it to this history of unequal power.
Right.
It's like the arson becomes a metaphor for a much larger problem.
And that problem is multifaceted. Economic, political, but also cultural.
Yeah.
This influx isn't just about numbers, it's about how Puerto Rican identity is impacted.
And that's where that anecdote from Bad Bunny's short film, Debbie Tier Armas Photos, becomes so poignant. You have this old man searching for a traditional quesito in this gentrified bakery.
Right.
But he's met with English-speaking staff and, get this, bacon quesito options.
Yeah, that image of the vegan quesito, it's almost funny.
Yeah.
But it captures this fear of a Puerto Rico without Puerto Ricans, a Puerto Rico where their culture is being overshadowed.
It feels like we've gone from literal fire to a kind of cultural burning, this loss of something familiar. But before we get too doom and gloom,
Right.
let's shift gears and explore what agency Puerto Ricans DO have.
Okay.
What are the options being debated for their future?
The sources outline the big three: statehood, independence, and free association, each with its own pros and cons and a lot of emotional weight attached.
Okay, so statehood, that's the 51st star on the flag,
Yeah.
full voting rights, all the benefits and drawbacks of being fully integrated into the U.S. system.
Right.
What are the arguments for and against that?
Supporters say it's about stability and access to more federal funds,
Yeah.
a stronger voice in Washington. But critics worry it's just trading one form of dependence for another, that true Puerto Rican identity could be lost in the process.
And then there's independence, the most radical option.
Yeah.
Cutting the cord completely and becoming a sovereign nation. What's the appeal there?
For many, it's about finally being able to control their own destiny, making their own laws, charting their own economic course free from U.S. influence.
Yeah.
But the big question is, could they really thrive on their own?
Right?
There are concerns about economic viability, defense, all those practicalities.
So statehood is about integration, independence is about separation, and then that leaves free association as this middle ground.
Exactly. It's about negotiating a formal agreement,
Okay.
a sort of partnership where Puerto Rico has more self-governance but maintains some ties, like maybe a shared currency or defense system.
It sounds like a delicate balancing act.
It is.
But regardless of which path they choose, there's this underlying issue of trust.
Right.
Can the U.S. really be trusted to truly respect their decision, to let go of that control?
That's the million-dollar question. There have been 5 referendums since 1967.
Wow.
But ultimately, Congress has the final say. And even when Puerto Ricans voted for statehood in 2017, there was no real action from the U.S. side.
It reinforces that sense of powerlessness.
It does.
That no matter what they choose, someone else might overrule them.
Exactly.
Which brings us back to that arson attack, that moment of rage.
Right.
It's this stark reminder that even when we're talking about complex political solutions, there's a human element, a feeling of being unheard and unseen.
And that feeling, that frustration, can manifest in some unexpected ways.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder, what will it really take for those voices to be truly listened to? For a relationship built on respect and genuine partnership to emerge?
We've covered a lot of ground here, from fire to neocolonialism, economics to cultural identity. It feels like we're just scratching the surface.
Yeah.
But before we dive any deeper, let's take a moment to connect all this back to you, the listener.
Right.
Why should this matter to someone who's never even been to Puerto Rico?
I think it's about understanding the world that we live in, the complex legacies of colonialism that still shape so much of it. It's about empathy. It's about seeing how these seemingly distant events are actually connected to larger systems of power and inequality.
Yeah.
And ultimately, it's about asking ourselves, what kind of world do we want to create? One where everyone's voice matters, or one where some voices are perpetually silenced?
That's a powerful thought to leave us with. We'll be back to explore these questions further and hopefully find some answers, or at least some new ways of thinking about them.
You know, it's easy to get caught up in the big picture, the history, the politics, but what really struck me in these sources was the human cost of neocolonialism, you know, how it plays out in everyday life.
Yeah, that feeling of displacement.
Yeah, exactly.
That question, is there even space for in this version of Puerto Rico? The academic sources talk about something called internal colonialism, which I think helps explain this.
Okay.
It's like being colonized from within. one group holds the power and they use it to marginalize another group, often along racial or ethnic lines.
Yeah, and in Puerto Rico, you have this added layer of the mainland U.S. with Act 60 almost like supercharging that whole dynamic.
Right.
Wealthy Americans coming in, often exempt from the taxes that locals have to pay.
Yeah.
Buying up property, creating businesses that cater to, well, people like them.
So it's not even just about being priced out. It's about seeing your community change in ways that really don't benefit you.
Exactly.
It's like that Cosito anecdote that we talked about.
Right.
The old man wants something traditional, something that represents his Puerto Rico, and it's just nowhere to be found.
It really ties into this idea of foreigners being seen as a threat, not just to the economy, but to the culture itself. And I think it's important to acknowledge that not every mainlander is going there to, exploit the system.
Absolutely.
Right.
The sources mention plenty of mainlanders who integrate and they learn Spanish and they contribute positively.
Yeah.
But there is this undeniable perception that Act 60 incentivizes a very specific type of person, those who are seeking financial gain above all else.
And that feeds into this image of Puerto Rico as this playground for the wealthy.
Yeah.
Not a place with its own complex history and a culture that deserves respect.
Right. It's like the arson incident.
Yeah.
It's not just about that fire. It's about what it represents.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've laid out some of the problems here, but what about solutions?
Okay.
The sources talk about these different paths to self-determination. Statehood, independence, free association.
Right.
It feels like each of those comes with its own set of anxieties about foreigners and the role that they play.
Absolutely. So statehood, becoming the 51st state, is about full integration, right? More rights, more federal funding, but also potentially more influence from the mainland.
Right.
Maybe even more of that cultural shift that people are so worried about.
So some people might see it as giving up even more control,
Exactly.
not gaining it.
Right. And then you have the opposite end of the spectrum. Independence, cutting ties completely, becoming a sovereign nation.
Yeah.
So theoretically, maximum control, but also so many unknowns.
Right.
Could they really go it alone economically? What about defense? And would that actually stop the influx of foreigners, or would it just change the nature of that relationship?
It's like swapping one set of anxieties for another.
It
And that leaves us with free association, that middle ground.
Right.
This partnership, but with more autonomy.
Mm-hmm.
But again, how much trust is there? Can those ties be strong enough to be beneficial without becoming shackles?
That's the crux of it.
Yeah.
And it's not just a theoretical debate. This is people's lives, their future.
Right.
The sources mention those 5 referendums, the majority voting for statehood in 2017, but still no real action from the U.S.
It's this constant reminder that they're not fully in control.
It is.
That even expressing their will doesn't guarantee anything.
Exactly.
No wonder there's this frustration, this feeling that no matter what path they choose, somebody else might just overrule them.
And that's where the changing attitudes towards foreigners get really complicated. It's not just about mainlanders coming in. It's about who really holds the power to shape the future of Puerto Rico.
Right.
It's about whether those voices from the island are truly being heard or if they're just drowned out.
Yeah, it's like that image of the fire consuming those businesses.
Right.
It's powerful, but it's also destructive.
It is.
It makes you think, what would a healthy relationship even look like?
Right.
Not just economically, but culturally, politically. How can respect be built when there's this history of such imbalance?
It's a question worth grappling with even for those of us who aren't directly impacted.
Yeah.
Because in a way, this story about Puerto Rico is like this microcosm of something much larger. It's about how we navigate global interconnectedness, how we deal with these legacies of colonialism that still shape so much of the world.
So as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, let's bring it back to you, the listener.
Okay.
What resonated the most with you?
Yeah.
Was it the historical context, the economic policies, the changing demographics, or that sense of cultural loss?
Right.
And more importantly, what thoughts or questions does all of this spark for you?
We've covered so much.
Right.
And it's easy to just feel overwhelmed by how complex all of this is.
Yeah.
But I think sometimes the most important step is to just listen.
Right.
Try to understand the perspective of those who are actually living with these realities.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And as we move towards the end of our deep dive, I want to highlight one more point from the academic sources that really stuck with me.
Okay.
They use this term archipelago to describe the Puerto Rican population.
Right.
And it acknowledges that it's not just the people on the island, but also those who have migrated to the mainland U.S.
That's such a powerful image.
Yeah.
You know, it suggests this shared experience that goes beyond those geographical boundaries.
Right.
It really makes you realize these issues. Neocolonialism, economic struggles, cultural identity, they resonate with Puerto Ricans no matter where they are.
It makes you wonder, could that shared experience, that archipelago mentality, could that be a source of strength?
It's a possibility.
Yeah.
It is.
Could it be a way to bridge those divides,
Mm-hmm.
to find some common ground,
Right.
and to advocate for a future that really reflects the needs and aspirations of all Puerto Ricans?
Yeah, it's a reminder that change often starts with connection, with understanding,
Yeah.
and with a willingness to really listen to those who have been marginalized or silenced.
So as we conclude our deep dive into this complex relationship between Puerto Rico and the mainland U.S., we'll leave you with one final thought to ponder.
Okay.
Imagine a future where Puerto Rico's fate is determined not by some outside force, but by the collective will of its people,
Mm-hmm.
both on the island and in the diaspora.
Right.
What would that future look like? And what role can each of us play in making that vision a reality?